All right. Welcome to, I guess, a follow-up interview with Christian theologian and apologist and frenemy, Randal Rauser. The last video on my channel, I had posted a critique, an internal critique of his Jesus Loves Canaanite books in conflict with Reformed Epistemology. And then Randall had me on his channel, and I'll have a link in the description box, to discuss the critique, and we had a wonderful conversation, and there were some follow-up points, and rather than just like make another video, I was like, our conversation was so good, we should just do this again. So Randall, you want to tell a little bit about yourself? I mean, most people watching might know, but by all means.
Yeah, I'm a professor in Edmonton, Canada at a Taylor Seminary. I write books in the area of theology, apologetics, Christian worldview, things like that. And so, yes, the most recent one was Jesus Loves Canaanites. I did my PhD some years ago on Alvin Plantinga's Reformed Epistemology in interaction with theological method. And kind of an outworking of that was a book I published in 2009 with Oxford University Press called Theology in Search of Foundations. So, yeah, I've been thinking about those kinds of issues for a while. So it's good to be here.
Thank you very much for coming. I was very much looking forward to this all weekend. So I think I definitely want to recommend, if you haven't seen our previous talk on Randall's channel, please go do so, because this is basically going to pick up from there. I think I'm going to try and give a quick summary of where we left off. I think the first point was my critique was more that I had brought up what was called the son of the great pumpkin objection. And the problem that I was posing was, well, it seems that given the moves you make in your book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, that something like the great pumpkin could be construed as properly basic, and this seemed like something Plantinga wanted to avoid. And your retort was to say, well, actually, no, it could be properly basic. Not, it isn't, obviously. We know it's something from a Peanuts cartoon, but something like that could be properly basic. Is that a fair assessment? I want to make sure we get this right. I want to make sure I get
sure.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second thing that I took away from our discussion that I thought was particularly worth diving into more was about how you're not going to find a neutral person or a neutral way to interpret the Bible, to approach the Bible. Would you like to elucidate on that maybe a little bit? I know I had tried in an offline discussion.
Well, yeah, so not just the Bible, but really any text. There's always the perspective of the interpreter. And really, that's not a controversial position. I think in hermeneutics, or hermeneutics is just sort of the formal big word for interpretation. Mm-hmm. So when you recognize in the interpretation of texts, people always bring particular backgrounds to the text. I mean, you can take something as trivial as a stop sign, and people will interpret stop signs in principle. You can interpret a stop sign differently depending on your cultural background as to what that red octagon means and how it should be interpreted. And if in a particular context, maybe it's ironic. Or how about this, practically, like some people interpret stop signs to mean come to a full stop. Some interpret to mean come to a rolling stop. I mean, and that's a stop sign. So when you think about a text like the Bible, which is actually a library of writings written between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago in 3 different languages in cultures very alien from the modern reader's culture, it's pretty clear that we're all going to have, and of course, even just add on to that, the history of interpretation and application of the Bible. Yeah, there's not going to be a neutral approach to the text for sure.
Okay, I think that's fair, and I certainly would agree. I mean, there's definitely something about how to interpret something like the Bible, and so just to make sure catch up a little bit for speed. I know we've been going a little fast. So what you did in Jesus Loves Canaanites was you said, "Hey, look, I come at this from a Christian perspective." And you believe you are justified in your deep-held moral intuition that genocide is wrong. Hard one there, right? And you say, look, the Bible says Yahweh commanded these genocides. These are very clearly genocides, and you go to great lengths to lay out why it would be considered that, and you go, well, I'm going to interpret this. And God's authorship in the Bible was not to say genocide is okay. You're giving Christians a way to interpret those texts so that they don't have to become a just war apologist or a genocide apologist of sorts. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah. One thing that I would just say as an aside is that, like I agree with you, obviously, because I wrote this book. So I agree with you that when you sort of have this incredulity toward people who would defend seemingly the ethics of genocide or the ethics of the text, but maybe try to read it differently than genocide, like what I call the just war interpreters. I share your incredulity toward their project, but I also want to keep in mind that pretty much every person who tries to develop a worked out ethical system is going to stumble at certain points, because what they do, I think, typically want to do is match their intuitions to theory. Mm-hmm. But often you will find intuitions and theory are at loggerheads with one another. So, for example, you could be a utilitarian and you say always act so that the greatest good can be maximized for the greatest number. And then the person says, okay, great in theory, but what do you do when you have a let's say a innocent person is blamed for a crime, and if you hang that person, that will stop the cycle of violence and it'll bring peace back to the community. So greatest good for the greatest number, but that person's actually innocent, yet your ethical system justifies killing that person. And so that's where the utilitarian now has to think, do I have to tweak my theory in light of the fact that it's at loggerheads with this intuition? And so it's the same right here, where you have the Christian who's trying to have these traditional interpretations of the text, but they're at loggerheads with their moral intuitions. And so, I think the Christian now is on a project of how to remove the cognitive dissonance, just like the utilitarian is in the example I gave. But I think all of us, as we're wrestling through what our ethical theory is, we are going to find that will arise at points where our theory doesn't seem to match our intuitions. And so we have to consider, do we reject our intuitions at some point, or do we revise our theory?
Right. And I think we at least are in agreement that I'm not revising my intuition of genocide being wrong, right? And so I guess where I came at it was I kind of look up, at least what I presented in our last discussion was, say, if we could find some like non-monotheist, let's say it's a polytheist, non-Christian, non-atheist, to go, okay, we're going to explain monotheism, explain atheism, here's this text, the Bible, and they're going to get to these genocide portions, or I think more aptly, almost the slavery portions. And they're going to go, this isn't the work of a good being, right? This Yahweh character could not be God, as you have described the monotheistic God. And then your response there, as somebody who does believe already that Yahweh is obviously the God of all creation, that, well, we're going to reinterpret it this way. I'm going to have this evidence in the text of, it says Yahweh commanded this genocide, and you go through your very detailed methods in the book of, you come up with your 5 principles of how you would approach interpreting the text to not do that, not come out with the conclusion Yahweh commanded a genocide. And I guess this gets into like a general problem of like, is there really no neutral way to approach evidence? And this itself seems to be almost at loggerheads, might be the word of the evening, with other evidentiary arguments that are done in apologetics. So I know in some of your other, in your blog and other published works, you refer to something with, say, Michael Shermer. He's an editor of Reason magazine, famous skeptic since, like, I guess the 70s, I think. And somebody had thrown at him in an interview, what would be evidence of, for that would prove to you God existed. He goes, well, if we had an amputee and we could prove he was amputated, and then somebody said a prayer and touched his limb, and then the limb regrew, that would be enough. And then he quickly revised, he walked it back, and he goes, you know what? Actually, that would just be evidence that human beings sometimes have the capacity to regrow limbs, right? And to me, I hear him say that, and I go, you've gone too far, buddy, right? You can logically, it is logically possible to like we had talked about, naturalism is infinitely malleable, can be just as unfalsifiable as any theistic view, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But when you get to that point, it seems unreasonable to me to try and dogmatically hold to a naturalism. And so I almost want to say the same thing when we go through, and this is how we interpret the Old Testament and all of these different things. And that's why I think slavery becomes more of a problem than the genocides, because you can argue at least the genocides didn't really happen. They were driven out, or archaeological stuff makes it really shaky. But the slavery stuff is real, right? Like, we know that happened historically. And there are texts laying out the regulation of chattel slavery. So to say, well, Yahweh didn't command that, it seems like you're almost making the same move Shermer does. Like, would you say Shermer's being unreasonable? Is he being reasonable? Like, is it too different of a kind to compare?
So, I mean, first of all, for those who are interested, I first refer to that case in my 2012 book, Swedish Atheist, The Scuba Diver and Other Apologetic Rabbit Trails. But it's actually based, I believe, on a 2009 episode of the show Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, where Shermer was on talking about miracles with another guy who was a Christian arguing for evidence of miracles. And so the question was, well, what kind of miracle would constitute evidence of God's divine action? And I just like to take that to share sort of the details so that we keep it moored, that it doesn't become a decontextualized, dehistoricized anecdote, right? It's always good to just keep them moored in the original examples. What I think that is good about that example, one thing here, is that when you say, well, Shermer's gone too far there, the point I'd want to make is that who decides what too far is? Now, here's another way to think about it, and I like to use this as an illustration because it gives numbers, so it's kind of easier to track with our intuition. So let's say that, well, my mom and dad, they sold a car probably 25, 30 years ago. And then they believed that God wanted them to donate the money to the school for the sale of the car. And they had sold the car for $2,450. And so they decided they're going to donate the money to the Christian school where my mom was principal, because God wanted them to. And so when they donate the money, the outstanding amount that the school needed to raise was $2,450. So there's this really nice fit between the money they had and they believed God wanted them to donate and the money that the school needed. It was the exact same amount, $2,450. Some people would hear that and they would say, wow, that's divine action. Other people would say that's called coincidence. So then you go, okay, what if it was $24,452, right? You add another. What if you say it was $243,187? You keep adding numbers, and that was the exact same amount that was required. At what point does a person say, you know what, that is so unlikely, and it is such a surprising fit that I'm compelled to believe this was, in fact, divine action? And the thing is, to my mind, there's just no view from nowhere that tells you when that point is in which a rational person ought to believe that it was, in fact, an answered prayer. I think people, whether it's that or whether it's the limb growing, they're going to have different intuitions. And those intuitions are going to be made relative to their background sets of beliefs, which are going to provide a framework for how incredulous they are toward evidence that appears to disconfirm their beliefs.
Okay, so, and this is why I am so glad I wanted to have a discussion rather than try to put that up as like a video. So I think that's a very good. You hit on the key underlying point that it seems to be that we could like draw these lines like reasonable, unreasonable, right, and where you make that fit happen, but there's no big objective way to say you've gone too far, you've not gone too far, and like how you would get there. And I think so this might relate to another problem, another debate I wouldn't say debate, but a discussion we had over the arguments for the resurrection. So that's where I was going to go next in terms of, like you say, if there's not a neutral way to approach the Bible, but the resurrection argument at least seems to take a sort of evidentialist approach, right? Whereas the Reformed epistemology is made to eschew the evidentialist approach. And so I was saying, and if you have a properly basic belief, that it needs to be defeatable, right, in order to hold on to your properly basic belief. But when we're talking about properly basic and how we approach the texts, this is pre-evidential, right? That's the Reformed epistemology. They get out of the evidentialist mindset, and we say, okay, well, if I'm looking for a defeater, and I go to these biblical texts, and it says Yahweh permitted chattel slavery, he commanded a genocide, and we go, well, my properly basic belief justifies me in reinterpreting that so that it doesn't violate my intuitions. But then when we get to the New Testament, and we get to the Gospels and the Paul's letters, and we say, well, look, here's these testimonial evidence pieces that Jesus rose from the dead. We're going to try and kind of come at it in this evidentialist way. See, this is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. But then, would it not be for... I think there are better answers than this for a skeptic, and I gave as much in my arguments, but you could just say, well, there's just no God. This is just made up, right? Like this, I'm justified in my atheism, and no, this was just made up. I don't have to give you reasons why this is there. People just made stuff up. Off we go. Like, is that... I would imagine you would call that unreasonable, or...
Well, the person who says, no, they just made it up, would I call that unreasonable? One of the things here, to my mind, is like the kind of overriding concern to identify when people are being reasonable or unreasonable often strikes me as a kind of power move. And it's kind of like, you're now unreasonable. And I think that what's more helpful probably is, and nuanced, is to talk about, well, what is the more virtuous approach? And so when you talk about epistemic virtue versus epistemic vice, so epistemic virtue is an openness to prima facie disconfirming data for whatever your beliefs are, a willingness to consider alternative hypotheses to things that you already accept to be true. And so I would just say, if we want to be people of virtue, then if there are people that seem to be smart and we value their opinion and they hold views different than us, then we ought to keep an open mind about what they believe and why. And so if you think there are some Christians that you think are relatively smart people and they can articulate the reasons for why they believe Jesus rose from the dead, then just keep an open mind and consider the reasons. But if you're kind of just flippant, well, I just think it's this, I mean, you have every right to do what you want, but it does seem to me that in terms of that framework I laid out of virtue, it's probably not the most virtuous way to approach it, particularly if you want to have a good, meaningful conversation or interaction with those people. So that's my initial thought.
So this might be turning into less of a debate and more of a problem that I see with this approach. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. I think we might actually be stuck in this sort of, well, where do we draw this line, and how to be virtuous and how to be, you would be not virtuous. So the problem that it seems to me, so like another example would be what we see, unfortunately, in my country, and in your country probably looking down terrified, is this whole, what we had happen in the last election with Trump and QAnon and the big lie and the insurrection on January 6th. And these people, many of whom, and this is not to denigrate you, obviously this is not at all Christians, right? But they are largely U.S. right-wing conservative evangelical Christians who believe Trump is God's chosen, who believe that the election was stolen. Do they have any evidence? None. They're doing these crazy outlandish audits that aren't even returning results that would show that, that Biden won a state that should have gone to Trump, right? There's no evidence of fraud, but they keep insisting, well, the Democrats stole it. There's no way. I just know. And some of them do tie it to divine revelation. I mean, there are famous examples that could be played of this, right? Pastors with large congregations. And so do we have to look at that and go, they're reasonable, right? It seems to me I'm going, no, these people you've gone too far. The evidence is just so daunting against it, I think. But is it just, oh, well, that's your subjective opinion and we have to respect their views, right? And like, I don't want to be a power move, but at the same time, this has drastic consequences for the world's politics, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that we don't ever opine on when we believe people are being irrational or not, and clearly, people who continue to believe that um, Biden lost the election, and I mean, the QAnon mythos is quite extraordinary, right? Which is underlying a lot of this, which is that there is this worldwide satanic cabal, and it has infiltrated the highest echelons of the Democratic Party, of government, of Hollywood. So Tom Hanks, of all people, is like a cannibalistic pedophile who worships Satan. I mean, people believe this, and
Yeah.
it's kind of it's for us. I mean, it's crazy stuff. I mean, the one thing we have to kind of try to get into the mindset of how people come to believe those kinds of things. Um, it is through stepwise a lack of virtue in terms of critically examining one's own biases, considering, well, is Facebook really like the best place to be getting your undiluted interpretation of reality? So I mean, there's a whole conversation there about that, but I'm just saying as a general rule, like just declaring, um, like this is extreme. QAnon and that is all kind of an
It's
extreme case in that.
sure, but then we could. I mean, like you could. It's not a far hop, skip, and jump to go to young Earth creationism, right? Ken Ham and his ilk, right? Or you could go to Frank Turek and the denial of evolution, right? I mean, that's a major Christian apologist who's not looked down upon quite like Ken Ham is, but I mean, he's got a fairly substantial audience, and it's not a small percentage that hold that. And then you go, well, how reasonable is that, right? And I know you specifically are you believe evolution is true. You take a intelligent design approach style approach, I believe, right? If I don't want to misconstrue your position, but so it's not saying that all Christians are unreasonable here, but it seems like I want to point to that and go that does seem to me to be an unreasonable position to hold in light of all the evidence that we have. But then they would come back and go, oh, well, I interpret it based on my faith. And they might even point to Plantinga's Reformed Epistemology and reveal, like, what God reveals. As soon as you say God reveals certain truths to me, and then I reinterpret all evidence you present to me in light of that fact, that seems to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that there's any huge thing we're disagreeing about here. I think, though, one of the challenges is like, how do you
Uh-oh.
know? Okay.
Can't
Well,
keep
see, it's a reminder that we're not just talking heads on YouTube. We do have lives.
Yes. um, so where were we?
Well, look, like, so one of the challenges for each one of us is, if we really want to be beings of epistemic virtue, one of the challenges is to try to get into the headspace of a person who does accept QAnon or does accept young Earth creationism or does accept some other thing that we think is absurd, and try to understand how it is and why that they come to hold that belief, rather than sort of just leap to the label of irrational and kind of just wanted to write them off. In one of my books, I was called "You're Not as Crazy as I Think," which I believe is quite appropriate for this kind of discussion. And in that book, I pointed out that Christians and atheists and all sorts of other people, and this was came out 10 years ago, and I think it's just gotten a lot worse since I wrote that book, but that we all tend to want to label people from outgroups that have very different plausibility structures, very different interpretation of reality than us. We want to label them as being irrational and or immoral. And so you either want to say, well, there's some fundamentally intellectual deficit in them, or there's some fundamental character deficit in them, or maybe both, and then that's why they disagree with us. And that may be true to some degree, but I suspect in many cases, if not most cases, if we take the time to really understand how other people come to hold the beliefs that they do in fact hold, then we'll at least have a lot more sympathy with them, and we'll probably be a lot more effective at reaching them in terms of sharing winsome arguments with them.
So I get that, and then on an interpersonal level, I think that's great advice. And in some respects, I can appreciate that in like our dialogue, right? I share with you, like, I went through my angry atheist phase, and I don't want to. I your work in particular and others has convinced me like, oh no, it's not irrational to be a theist. It's not irrational to be a Christian, even, right? Even specific. I don't think the arguments. I think it's particularly troublesome to get from theism to Christianity, and so when I make my case against the resurrection, it's more such that I'm trying to show the argument doesn't work, right? That's kind of how, like, because theoretically you make arguments and you're trying to convince someone, right, of their, that your position is the correct one. Weigh the evidence, and then you'll see I come out ahead. And I look at as why I like counter apologist is to counter the argument and say, well, no, the argument doesn't actually work. And I think that's probably a more modest goal, a more successful approach. But at the same time, like you say, well, we can understand the QAnon person, we can understand the young Earth creationists. The problem is that they do have, like, especially those things can have drastically negative effects on the rest of us. And there seems to be, like I said, I don't think theism or Christianity is irrational flat off, but then I think young Earth creationism is irrational. I think there is just so much objective evidence that it is irrational to state that. And I could try to understand why people would hold that view. I've had people in my own family who held that view. And I tried to talk to them about it, and then it just became something, well, we're going to partition it off. But that's one thing, and we can argue about textbooks and everything like that, and that there is harm there. But then when you get to things like, if you see this strategy of moving to the political realm, it gets dangerous. And we had an insurrection over this. Like, congressmen almost died. Congresspeople, I should say. And I just don't know how to resolve that.
If we think back to 9/11, right? So that's 20 years ago, this September. And then in the wake of 9/11, some people wanted to have a conversation. And the conversation they wanted to have was to ask what would lead these 19 or 21, whatever it was, terrorists to fly these planes into buildings. And then they began to talk about things like the presence of the U.S. in the Middle East and how this was, in terms of having military bases in places like Saudi Arabia, and how many fundamentalist Muslims took this as a real affront to their faith. And so that was a catalyst for people like bin Laden wanting to attack the United States. People like Robert Pape, the political scientist, have pointed out how this kind of actions like suicide bombings and so on are almost always tied to geopolitical ends. Mm-hmm. So to have that conversation, some people wanted to ask why they flew the planes into the buildings and what catalysts there were. Other people didn't want to have that conversation. In fact, they're outraged by it. And the reason they're outraged by it was because they said, well, you're trying to justify what they did. They were just evil. Right? And they just wanted to drop this categorical label on these people that flew these planes into buildings. And
or worse, actually.
What's that?
I would say, or worse, they wanted to go to war, right? And they had a vested interest. So this is where it gets dangerous. And I don't want to cut off your point. So if you want to finish your point, and then I'll finish interjecting, or however you want to do it. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, so my simple point being that that I don't think that just saying that they are evil without looking at what were the catalysts for them thinking that they were justified in doing what they did, I don't think that helps anybody, because that doesn't actually address the underlying issues. So to begin to look at the geopolitical catalysts that could have motivated these guys to do this absolutely unjustified, heinous, evil action, that is very important. And in the same way, rather than just label QAnon people or young Earth creationists or someone else, they're just crazy, they're just irrational or whatever, let's look at the underlying catalysts as to how people come to hold these beliefs, why they hold them, why they think they're justified based on the evidence. And then that is going to be more productive at us kind of to be able to reach out to them and prevent people from holding beliefs that we think are false and perhaps dangerous.
So the problem, I think, I agree. I agree with your overall point about we should have interrogated why these things happened, right? I think there's obviously big geopolitical reasons as to why. It doesn't justify what they did. But then, a lot like the QAnon, where you could say, well, we understand it, we want to try and fight against those beliefs. But some of these people, they really did buy into it, and they wanted this sort of conflict. Just like you would say the people who just said, oh, they're evil, right? They're just evil. They hate our freedom, right? And they want to have that view, and they don't want to interrogate the geopolitical reasons why, because they want to continue to exploit things in the Middle East. And so they want to point out how reasonable it is to say that, well, I'm justified in thinking they just hate our freedom, and that Islam is just evil, right? And there's no... and it doesn't even necessarily have to be conscious or even truly that nefarious, right? That they just really do think. There are people who really did just think that they were just evil, and they just hate our freedom. And that brought us into this war that 20 years later we're only just getting out of, and not under the best circumstances. And I just don't see a good way of I don't know how we solve that problem. And then we might somehow tie this back to our original topic of evidence and genocides, and I think the argument for the resurrection. But are we really just that stuck? Like this is a general problem that we are applying to a specific instance of. I want to say that genocides and slavery are evidence that Yahweh is not God, and then you reinterpret that on the light of your pre-existing beliefs. And then conversely, on the resurrection, you will say, hey, look, here's all this testimony from these different sources, and that would prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And I want to say, well, I have lots of testimony for lots of miracles, and they contradict each other, and I don't believe there's a God because of problem of evil/love and a variety of other reasons, so I'm justified in saying Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and that's not good evidence. And we sort of fight over what the framing is, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, look, like the fact that I recognize the degree to which people have different distinct starting points and plausibility frameworks that screen out how they interpret data, what they find to be plausible. See, what that should do for me, and for anyone who recognizes that, is to make them more effective at being able to reach out to other people, because they can begin to understand where they're coming from and how they in fact end up differing, rather than talking in a sort of uncritical way about magisterial reason. So, for example, when we say, well, that belief is irrational, and we speak in a sort of unqualified way about something, well, the first thing we have to keep in mind is that people always are holding beliefs relative to a background set of beliefs and experiences. So, for example, when people say, well, young earth creation is like believing the earth is 6,000 years old, that's irrational. Well, let's first of all recognize that it's not diachronically irrational. In other words, it's not irrational at all points in history, because there was a point where there wasn't that same amount of evidence for the 4.6 billion year age of the earth, and people didn't have access to that. And so it wasn't reasonable in that context for them to believe the earth was young. So then you say, okay, but of course that applies now as well. Not everybody has access to all the evidence to believe the earth is old. And so for those individuals, relative to the data set to which they have access, they could believe reasonably that, in fact, the earth is young. And so once you recognize that, then you can realize people rationally can have different beliefs. One person can believe X, another person can believe not X, because they're believing it relative to some different background set of beliefs. And once we recognize that, we will perhaps chasten our tendency to speak in a magisterial absolute way about what is rational or irrational, and rather recognize that those ascriptions should be made relative to specific individuals with specific beliefs, relative to specific background data sets of belief.
Right, and I can definitely go with, at least for some people, that it's definitely rational. And I think when I think of rational and irrational, there's the basic sense of like it's not logically contradictory, at least, right? And even that, I think, gets into problems we talked about in our previous discussion. Like, you would have people who would say, well, things like the Trinity or the Incarnation are irrational. And then you would say, well, no, I have this different metaphysical assumptions about being and personhood, and I bring those assumptions in, and then I resolve the apparent contradictions, right? So even pointing to just pure conceptual analysis seems to be almost problematic in terms of determining what is rational and irrational. But then, I guess when you say, well, it's rational relative to some background knowledge, right? They have what knowledge they have access to. But then when you present evidence for the age of the Earth, the speed of light, multiply attested, verified in a variety of ways, right? And then you could point out all of these different things, the geological record and the cosmic microwave background radiation and everything else in cosmology. They go, no. I mean, Ken Ham has heard all of that. And Ken Ham is still steadfast in his young Earth, calling other Christians heretics for daring to say otherwise, right? Let alone us atheists. And at that point, do we get, like, not that I want to wield it as a cudgel, but it certainly does seem to be a harmful belief in certain contexts, in certain applications. And it does seem to be, in light of all of that evidence, you're taking a very ad hoc method to keep your, to take all that information in and then keep it be rational, right? To say, well, I've not contradicted myself. I've adhered to some set of principles, no matter how ad hoc, to keep it there. And are we just stuck?
First of all, I think we need a little more in terms of rationality than absence of contradiction. So
interesting.
Yeah, I think, for example, you could talk about a rational belief, to borrow from Anthony Kenny. He describes a rational belief as the mean between skepticism and credulity. In other words, being too credulous or too apt to believe something on inadequate grounds, and being too skeptical, being too critical, because you can be one or the other, right? You can be the person who believes everything you read on Facebook, or you can be the person who won't even believe 2 + 2 = 4 because an evil demon might be misleading them. And each one of those persons, I think, is irrational, or you could argue that they're being irrational, but in very different ways. One is too credulous, the other is too skeptical. And so to be rational is to find the sort of the golden mean. And that's helpful, I think, because, of course, when Aristotle talks about virtues, he talks about a golden mean between two vices. So to be generous is the golden mean between being too stingy and too extravagant, right? The person who will never spend a dime on their friends, and the person who spends empties their bank account to take their friends out for dinner at a $10,000 a plate restaurant. I mean, those are two very different things, but they're both lacking in proper generosity. And generosity is that golden mean. And courage is the golden mean between being foolhardy and being cowardly. And so then you say rationality is an intellectual virtue. It's an intellectual golden mean between overt credulity and overt skepticism. And so I think that's helpful. And then you can kind of say, okay, at what point, when a person who is prima facie rational but has access to a different data set than I do, at what point does the mounting evidence against their view become such that they are now becoming irrational to continue to hold it? And that's a great question. It's not entirely easy to answer that, and for a few different reasons. I mean, one reason is that I think every belief system, I'm going to just give two reasons so that I don't rattle on too much more. But one of them is because every belief system is going to have some degree of unanswered question or paradox. So when I hear creationists and intelligent design theorists and others, they cite Darwin in this famous or infamous quote. He says, if one example of a modification that could not be arrived at through gradual succession of steps could be identified, then my entire theory would break down. And people kind of quote that triumphantly and then say, well, we have it, bacteria flagellum or something like that. Right. And that is just failing to understand how theory actually works, because theories are overarching explanatory frameworks for data. And a theory can accommodate some degree of anomaly. Some things, because of the overarching explanatory force of the theory, you may not be able to explain X or Y, and those may be a paradox or an antinomy or just some prima facie disconfirming data, but you maintain the theory and continue to try to work on that mystery bit. And so that's the same thing when you have the young earth creationist encounter some data against it, and then they can, at least for some period, they're, I think, justified in continuing to hold their belief as they're working on the evidence against it. The other thing, and this gets into a little bit of a dicey one, but it's when people kind of introduce these kind of can be indoctrinational categories. So, for example, well, everybody who holds this other view is holding to a lie, and so we know that they're deceived by the devil. I mean, that's an extreme example.
Sure.
But then, if you have that as a background in belief, which can definitely become indoctrinational, then every time anyone does come to that, you have an undercutting defeater, which undercuts their testimony because, well, they're not a reliable resource.
Right.
Now, I throw that out there for two reasons. One, because I think it's often operative and it can be indoctrinational, but also I think that there are times where that kind of belief can be justified. So for example, when the and I'll end with this, but let's say that the parents sending their kid off to first year ethics class, and they know that they're going to hear a lot of theories, and they just say, look, you're going to hear a lot of theories challenging whether there's such a good thing as good and evil. What you have to know is that good and evil does exist. And you may not be satisfied with all the theories, but don't become an anti-realist, because really they don't know what they're talking about here.
Hey, now.
And so that would be a case where I think that'd be maybe a little more justified. And so anyway, so yeah, I'll just throw it. But those are those two pieces. So there's always room for paradox, and you can have people can be given categories that could be indoctrinational but may not be, but that may screen out disconfirming data.
I do find that very entertaining, because I have more and more been finding myself in what could be called an anti-realist camp. But that's an aside. Rabbit Trail, one of your other books, I think, referenced one of those. So just one thing to comment before getting on, I think hopefully maybe the final topic, was when you mentioned it's about virtues, right? And I'm very sympathetic, at least, to the project of virtue ethics, right? So you would look at a utilitarianism or a Kantian-style deontological view, right? You have this very clear answer of good and bad, like this would be good, this would be bad. Whereas virtue ethics doesn't do that, right? There are no hard rules, right? And so we're trying to find where the virtue is, and that's the journey, right? And it does seem to be that that becomes a very subjective thing, and that's the strength and weakness, I guess you would say, of going the virtue way.
Well, I mean, I would say I'm most sympathetic with virtue ethics, and I believe rape is always wrong. So I mean, there are all sorts of things
right
you can believe are fundamentally lacking in virtue. So you do have all sorts of
you
have all
there
sorts
are those
of
sorts of things, right? But there would be when is the charge at the enemy foolhardy, and when is it courageous, right? And that becomes something that's very hard to determine, right, or subjective to determine. So that would be like a non-moral, I guess, question.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's just helpful with virtue ethics, I think, is that these other approaches to ethics, situational ethics, deontological, utilitarian ethics, have tended to focus on cases, and in particular, problem cases. And so, as the saying goes, hard cases make bad law. Right? So when you want to make a law, you don't begin with the most difficult, awkward cases and then go from there. You begin with cases that are going to cover 99% of human experience. But when you begin with the Pandora's box cases, like the trolley problem, for example, or whatever, then you can kind of get off on this endless intellectual exercise. And what the virtue ethics does rather is say, well, no, let's start off with character. And what does a good person look like? And one important thing about that is also this, is that it recognizes the fact that ethics is ultimately not about having the right answer for something, but it's rather about having the right character and living rightly. Because who gives a crap if you know all the right answers and you're a terrible person? Ethics has to be really about the transformation of character. And so that's what virtue ethics says at the center of the goal, of the mission, is to form your character into a person of virtue. And then if you do that, the more that you do that, the more apt you will be to have the right answers in the right moment. So that, for example, when this school shooting at Stone Douglas, I think it was a high school in Florida a few years ago, the shooting starts, and one of these cops, or rent-a-cop, I'm not sure if he was a
He
cop.
was a
I
cop.
think
Yeah.
he was actually, yeah, he ran the opposite direction
Yep.
of the firing. He lacked virtue. Now, he knew the right answer, what you do, but his character wasn't formed to run toward the sound of gunfire. And that's something you got to work on, right? You got to develop the character that is going to lead you toward the gunfire rather than away from it. And that's more important. And that's what virtue ethics is about.
Right. So, I guess I very much appreciate that what you're saying there, and so I kind of want to bring this back to where we started on how we are approaching the question of. So I look at the evidence for the Old Testament atrocities, we'll say, and then I like to contrast that with, like, because that would be something I think that favors atheism, or at least the non-Christian position, right? And then we're going to come back, and then the other side of it would be, I guess, the resurrection argument, right? Whereas you say, hey, look, I have all of these pieces of testimonial evidence, and then my particular approach is to say, well, those kinds of testimonial evidences are not very good to establish a miracle, right? And I think we would reject them in other contexts, and so I should reject them in the Christian one. And so there's, I guess, two topics there, is that when we have the argument, the resurrection, so if we have a debate on the resurrection argument, right, are we just trying to draw the line as to where the virtue is in terms of how I'm going to approach this evidence specifically, right? Are we just trying to kind of lay out our case and then convince somebody that we're on the right side of the virtuous line? Is that it? If there's no neutral way to approach the Bible, there's no neutral way to interpret a text, right? And I come at this evidence with my background, then, I can make my case, you can make yours. Is that really what we're coming at here when we try to, when we have that resurrection debate, right? There's going to be a million of them on YouTube in the next 3 months, right? Is that ultimately kind of what's happening?
Well, first of all, in terms of the virtue, it's not a matter of deciding who's virtuous and who's not.
Right.
Because, as I said, people can be rational and hold different beliefs. It also then follows, you can just follow out the logic here, people can be epistemically virtuous and come to different conclusions. A person can be epistemically virtuous in principle and look seriously at the Bible and say, I just don't think that this is the word of God in the way that Christians claim. I think a person can also be epistemically virtuous, do the due diligence, and draw a contrary conclusion. So I don't think that debates are really about that. But I just do think, as I always say when it comes to apologetics, which just is the attempt to argue your views in a winsome, appreciable way to someone with whom you disagree,
Right.
that there are just two motivations for that. And the first motivation is if you have a belief that you think is important. And the second motivation is if you think this other human being is important, such that you want them to hold that belief that you think is important. If you hold the belief as important and you value another human being, then that's the sufficient ground to want to engage in an apologetic discussion with them, so that it's not about deciding who's virtuous and who's not, but it's rather an attempt to try to win people over to that which you believe to be true. But also along the way, recognizing the degree to which we are fallible and we should be open to correction and to learning from others. And so, as Henry Nouwen says, listening is the highest form of hospitality. So the best apologetic is going to always be one where the person is as least as willing to listen and learn as they are wanting to talk and to win an argument.
Right. And I certainly can appreciate it. I think that's why we're both here, right? I mean, I understand from your perspective, you think Christianity is important, and then there are eternal consequences to that belief, and you believe people are valuable. And so you are trying to spread the gospel, and conversely, I think Christianity is not true. I think that it certainly we'll have our disagreements, but in general, other Christians and their moral teachings, I think, are particularly harmful. And I do think people are valuable. And so when people grew up in that context and then find themselves disagreeing and finding their way out of belief, and they get called irrational. That's kind of why I still do this. That's why I want to have these conversations. I could obviously just give up and whatever. I've got games to play. But so I certainly agree with that. We're both engaging in a sort of an apologetic. We're engaging in defense of our view, arguing things that we think are true. I guess the final bit that I'm wondering about, that I think would be good to end on, since this was originally at least about Reformed epistemology, was this very big difference in approach, where Reformed epistemology, and it seems moderately widespread, and I've had this with other people when I would present my argument against the resurrection about, there's all these different testimonies for miracles from contradictory religions, right? It's the basis of my objection. And I've had other people point out that, you're taking an evidentialist assumption that's how we should approach this question, and that's a flawed assumption I do not grant. And they want to go to the Reformed epistemology and Plantinga's AC model of having this properly basic belief, and then it reveals to me that Jesus was resurrected. And it seems to me that one of the key differences between atheists and Christians, and when we start to have these debates, especially over miracles or what's the correct interpretation of the Old Testament, we're arguing about, am I going to not assume God exists or that God has revealed to me that Jesus is raised, and then try to be neutral in a scientific style sense and go the evidentialist path, follow all the evidence we can find and come to a conclusion? Or are we going to go to the Reformed epistemology style and say, no, I'm starting here, right? And I'm not going to, it is the wrong, treating the question of does God exist or is Christianity true from an evidentialist framework is incorrect, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, ironically. That was Plantinga's project, right? Was to say, no, you do not have to take the evidentialist view in the question of does God exist and is Christianity true? Right? Are we trying to have that argument as to what paradigm we should be in?
Well, there's two different issues here. The one issue is the question of how does a person have rational belief, justified belief, or knowledge? Mm-hmm. And the second is, how does a person seek to win over people who don't share their beliefs? And so on the first one, do you have to have an evidentialist argument showing that the historical resurrection of Jesus is the best hypothesis for the available data in order to be a Christian? And Plantinga, I think rightly, would say, no, you don't have to have that argument. On the second issue, though, is there value in developing arguments in order to win over people who do not have the same starting point, the same set of background beliefs that you do? Of course, there's great value in that. So, I mean, if a person were to say, I'm a skeptic because there are a lot of different miracle claims in the ancient world, I mean, I would say, well, how do you not avoid generalizing that argument by saying you become a skeptic about any historical claim because there are other contrary claims that have been made by other persons? And I would say that's not a good argument for general historical skepticism. What you simply do is you weigh the competing claims and look at the evidence for them. And I would say narrowly, in the case of the resurrection, you do the same. So when there are specific miracle claims, then you weigh the evidence for those claims. So that would be a way that I would try to have an interactive conversation with you about your argument. Because, of course, for me to simply say, no, the Bible or the Holy Spirit testifies to me, that settles it, mic drop, obviously that's not going to get us very far.
Right. And unfortunately, some people will take that view. And you'll find them on Twitter. I don't want to turn this into a debate about the resurrection and historical facts. I do think that there are, I don't necessarily think I guess my claim would be more along the lines of there are equally as well attested claims of miracles for contradictory religions, right? And we can go to a variety of different moderately contemporary examples versus ones that are a couple hundred years ago, versus ones that are a bit more ancient, closer to Christianity, right? And you can when you get down to it, you get down to, well, I have X amount of testimonial claims for these things, and they're contradictory religions, and how do I know which one of these, if a miracle, to establish that the miracle actually occurred, versus somebody made something up or was mistaken, right? And that's always and a naturalist could always do that, right? A naturalist could always say, oh, they made it up, right? Or they were mistaken, right? You could go at it, and that's why I like to have you analyze the types of miracles there could be, right? And you could have this one class of empirically verifiable, repeatable miracles, and that could be done, but it's not, and that seems to me to give weight towards the interpretation that no, there is no God doing these miracles, right? And so I try to come at that from like an evidentialist thing to justify something like a methodological naturalism. And so and this could be, I don't want to assert my argument wins. It's more that I think that when you play the evidentialist game, the theist might be at a disadvantage. That's just what it seems to me, like for things like the resurrection.
See, I think what one does when one has alleged evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and alleged evidence for some miracle claim of Joseph Smith, and some alleged evidence for the miraculous. There you go. That's the one I've heard from you before, or the Quran, the origin of the Quran. What one does then is, what one doesn't say is, well, they're contradictory, so we can ignore all of them. No, what you do is you say, okay, let's look at all the possible explanations for this one. Let's look at all the possible explanations for this one. And you do each one of them piecemeal. And then at the end of the day, you could, in principle, end up with a picture that looks like this. It turns out that I think there is good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Quran is, in fact, of supernatural origin, and in fact, that Joseph Smith did receive the golden plates from Moroni. And if you came out and that those were, in fact, all the best explanations based upon your canvassing of all the evidence, you now have to consider theologically how you're going to interpret that. But what you don't do, I think, is a priori say, well, if we can find competing claims to different miracles, we're just going to not look at miracles, because I think that's really putting the cart before the horse. In fact, I fear that what you're trying to do is, or what you end up doing, is kind of just cutting yourself off from a range of potential evidence or data. So like in my last book, Conversations with My Inner Atheist, I had a chapter where I said we need to look at alternative evidence for alternative belief systems. And I gave an example of reincarnation. I think that Ian Stevenson, in his time at the University of Virginia, he gathered careful case studies that seem to support evidence, provide some degree of evidence for reincarnation. And it's not a belief system that is consistent with what I believe. But I think what you have to do is not just dismiss things a priori. You have to look at the evidence for it on its own terms. And I would say the same about any of these miracle claims or prima facie supernatural claims.
Right. So the only issue I really want to take there is when you say, like, I look at it a priori, and I think that I have extraordinarily good post priori justification for methodological naturalism. I am not saying from the get-go that I'm going to be a methodological naturalist and just rule all of these out. I think I have good justification for that based upon the types of miracle claims we have in the past for various contradictory religions, in comparison to the types of miracle claims that could happen if a God existed, right? Like the repeatable, empirically verifiable miracles, some of which are alluded to in parts of the gospel that were added at the end of Mark, right? The snake handlers and the drinking poison and all of that, right? And when you look at those sorts of things, and Jesus sending the disciples out to do miracles to convince people that his was the word, that gives you good reason to be a methodological naturalist, right? I think that is after the evidence. I'm not like I said in my argument, it was Michael O'Connor had an example about his head got cut off on stage in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, and then he came back out with his head attached. He said he went to heaven, and everybody interviewed him. He's got scars, and then I have the the priest turns the water into wine at every mass, right? These are empirically verifiable miracles. That would defeat methodological naturalism, right? That would undercut the justification I have for taking that view. So I kind of look at it from a wide berth of all of the miracle claims that we have, in addition to the types of miracle claims that had happened in the past or have claimed to have happened in the past versus what we have now and what could be. And that is what I think underwrites the methodological naturalism. It's not an a priori thing to me. It's very much after the evidence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, typically when I think methodological naturalism, I'm thinking of a position that says, in principle, history is closed to certain kinds of explanations, i.e. supernatural explanations. So in principle, according to historical method, all explanations must be natural. And that is an in principle, a priori approach to historical method or historiography. What you're describing here seems to me a little different than methodological naturalism. It's an argument based upon the alleged failure of quote unquote supernatural explanations. But you know, that to pursue that further would take us a little.
We would certainly go a little further. I think perhaps I haven't described it well enough, and you are correct. I do think history should proceed in that manner and be closed to it, and that principle that says I should be closed to it is justified by these other evidentiary considerations of miracle claims and types of miracle claims. But I think that might be a good place to end it. If there's something you'd like to close on, I'd certainly want to give you the floor.
Well, I would just close on saying that here what we've done is two different things. And so the one thing is kind of, at least certainly I've tried to do, is to point out how we need to recognize different people have different starting points and so on, and try to get into their headspace as to why they hold that. People can be rational and disagree with one another. The other thing, which we just closed on, is to recognize that once you do that, it's not the end of conversation, but rather the beginning of conversation. Because what it does is it allows you to engage more at a deeper level in a more productive way with people who don't share your plausibility framework, so that you're not left in a postmodern morass of where nobody can decide what's true. Everybody believes what is right in their own eyes, but rather we recognize that while we do have different starting points, we can still have charitable reasoned discussion with one another, as we've just had at the conclusion of this conversation about the resurrection. So on that, John, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our part 2 conversation.
Thank you very much. And I certainly want to end on the, again, appreciation and the fact that we all could stand to be a bit more charitable and recognize the reasonability of others, even though we disagree. And I am particularly glad that we had a conversation rather than me trying to make another countering video. So thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Take care.